Hi, my name is Tack, and I'm joined here by Omar Lamrani, and we'll be talking about the conflict in Syria. So, Omar, over the last few weeks, we've seen a lot of things moving across different parts of Syria, involving both the Russian rebel IS and the Syrian loyalist sides. Give us kind of a brief breakdown of what exactly is moving in which direction in the different parts of Syria.
So up north in Aleppo province, we've seen the loyalists backed by the Russians and the Iranians make considerable progress in two areas. They've been pushing towards Karirs air base, and they've also been taking terrain in southern Aleppo countryside. But on the other hand, the rebels have also been making progress, specifically in northern Hama province, where they beat back a loyalist offensive and went on the counteroffensive and took Morik and some other strategic villages.
So when you talk about this counteroffensive, are we seeing a very limited ability of Russia coming into the conflict to back the loyalists and actually ensure decent gains in their offensives? Like, how effective has their presence actually been?
Well, the presence of the Russians and the Iranians has, to a point, been quite effective in the sense that they've stopped the very large defeats that the loyalists were facing before. But there are serious limits to how much they can actually change the balance on the ground. They cannot beat back the rebels everywhere, as we have seen with Northern Hama. So essentially what the Northern Hama gains by the rebels demonstrate is that there is limitations to how much the Russians can actually impact the conflict. They do not have that many forces in Syria. It's 2,000 going to 4,000. That is not going to be a force sufficient to actually be a serious game changer on the ground.
Now, you mentioned the increase going from 2,000 to 4,000 Russian troops inside Syria. What exactly are we seeing the Russians bring in, and where are they going? Is there a particular intent that is obvious through the increases in Russian forces?
Mm-hmm. The Russian presence in Syria, to a large extent, and still is demonstrated by air power. So they have that Latakia air base with a lot of fixed-wing aircraft, and they brought in a lot of helicopters. But we're seeing a gradual change in the sense that they are starting to bring in artillery, rockets artillery units to the ground. We're seeing them embed more forces directly with Syrian army units. And so as they do bring these forces more on the ground, and they're spread out across the country, they're in Hama, they're in Aleppo, they're in Homs. As they do bring these forces to the ground, we are seeing more Russians come into the crossfire and potentially more Russian casualties. It's not the same as when they're only using air power, where there is less of a chance of the Russians suffering casualties.
And the Russians aren't the only ones coming into this conflict and supporting one particular side. We've seen the rebels gain a lot of support from their backers.
Yes.
What does that look like? What are they getting from who?
Principally, the biggest factor that's helping the rebels from the external side is the supply of anti-tank guided missiles, especially TOW missile systems. These have been quite handy and quite successful in bolstering the rebels, especially against the armor that the loyalists bring against them in their offensives. It's caused significant amounts of casualties, and it's also stopped a lot of the offensives on their track, as the loyalists have not yet been able to figure out an effective means of countering them.
Apart from the rebels and Russia / the loyalists and their Iranian and Hezbollah backers, one of the parties that initially was being talked about a lot, but that perhaps have featured less in our discussion here so far, is the Islamic State. What's happening there? So I understand they've been able to make some gains on the back of the increased escalation of conflict between the other sides. What exactly are they doing?
Yeah, the Islamic State, it's not that they haven't suffered some attacks from the loyalist side, especially if we're talking about the Karirs air base, where the loyalists are trying to relieve their forces there. They are coming under direct attack by the loyalist side, as well as rebels in northern Aleppo and so forth. But the problem remains that the vast bulk of the effort from both the loyalist side as well as the rebel side is directed against each other. And as such, Islamic State finds itself with a lot of leeway and a lot of space to mount its own attacks and take advantage and seize opportunities to take terrain and achieve their goals. So in the sense, until the rebels and the loyalist forces sort of stop directing the vast majority of their efforts against each other and start focusing on the Islamic State will not suffer the entire pressure that these sides can mount against them.
Do you think there will be such an ability on those sides to start focusing on IS? Because one of the things that the loyalists and the Russians and the Iranian troops face right now is the potential threat of rebels mounting a serious offensive against Hama. So how are they able to balance those different offensives against them and the ability to move against IS if they have any spare capacity?
The principal threats for the loyalist side, as well as from the rebel side, is the loyalists and the rebels from the other side. So that's as long as the IS does not come to a point where they do pose an existential threat, then they are left alone to a large extent, because again the focus is on the other parties. But when they do come to a point where they do pose a serious threat, an example would be when they are about to close the M5 highway going from eastern Homs. Then we see them loyalists in this case, redirect their efforts against pushing them back. So it's always going to be the other side that's going to be prioritized, but we do see occasional shifts towards fighting IS from both the rebels and the loyalists when the IS comes to a point where they do pose a very significant threat. Until we see a political situation, however, that negates the conflict between the loyalists and the rebels, I don't see IS becoming the top priority for either side.
Well, thank you very much. That's very interesting. Sadly, that's all we've got time for, but we'll continue to monitor the Syrian conflict here at Stratfor. And if you wish to find out more about this or other issues, please visit stratfor.com.